something that you know. There are going to be things that are still going to kill civilians, still going to kill people long after the peace treaties have been signed. Use of them, in my book, that's immoral.
If this is the best that FEMA can do, then everyone in this country should be very afraid if something happens in their neighborhood tomorrow.
If I were to put it in a very succinct phrase, I'd say it's too many people who thought there was such a thing as free lunch.
Good evening. There is no such thing as a nice weapon of war. After all, weapons are designed to kill. But tonight we're going to give you a look at a weapon that not only kills during warfare, but long after the fighting has ended. And the victims are people who never fought or are no longer fighting. These weapons are cluster munitions, or cluster bombs as they're more commonly known. They're small bombs contained in a larger bomb or artillery shell, which are designed to spread and detonate over a large area. In wartime, cluster bombs are, to put it bluntly, an efficient way to kill many people in an area the size of a football field. But many of those cluster bombs don't explode on impact as they are designed to do. They go off with deadly effect after the war is over, killing people trying to rebuild their normal lives, or, all too often, curious children. That's what's happened in the wake of the war in the summer of 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed radical Islamic militia in southern Lebanon. That war raged for just 34 days, but people in southern Lebanon are still dying today because they stumble over cluster bombs like these.
It's about the size of a soda can and just as innocent looking. That white ribbon attached to the top is supposed to arm the bomblet when it's dropped. This is how cluster bombs are supposed to work, as seen in this Air Force video. Large bombs or missiles disperse hundreds of bomblets across a wide area, but the bomblets often don't explode on impact the way they are designed to. The duds, also called submunitions, hang in trees or lay on the ground. Weeks or months later, just the slightest disturbance can set them off. A controlled explosion is the only way to neutralize the duds that fail to explode.
When I got here and climbed up the stairway over there, we could see them hanging in the trees. They were in the yard. They were up on the veranda in the stairs. We even found some inside the home.
Mark Garlasco went to southern Lebanon soon after the war to assess the damage. Garlasco now works for the organization Human Rights Watch. He was a senior military analyst for the Pentagon. We recently met him in the southern Lebanese village of Yokmor.
Well, when I first got here shortly after the ceasefire, walking down the street was actually pretty difficult because there were submunitions, littered everywhere. And so you would have to zigzag as you're going around and just be very careful.
Garlasco introduced us to Jamal, who returned to her village when the shooting stopped.
Very, very dangerous because we have to walk carefully. It's a bomb everywhere. The house was terrifying, the glass everywhere.
Jamal's house in the village was still standing, but she and her mother-in-law found cluster bombs everywhere.
My baby can't go outside because maybe a bomb will explode. I don't think that in America you have this problem.
هلا أنا جيت لقيت هون الأرض كلها مبدورة وهون فوق وأسطح.
Neighbor Mahmoud Barakat says he found 50 cluster bombs in his small olive grove. Like him, most residents in this area of southern Lebanon are farmers. With dud cluster munitions covering their fields, most were forced to watch their harvest and income rot away. After the war, Garlasco was touring a hospital when 3 children were rushed in. Hassan and Sukna had just returned to their village and were playing near their home when a cluster bomb exploded at their feet. They barely survived.
زتتني لورا مترين طلعنا صرينا برا قمت حطيت ايدي على صرينا صرت اركض قول الله اكبر.
Hassan spent several weeks in the hospital. More than a year later, his father tells us he still has pain in the belly and has trouble eating. Sukna still has shrapnel embedded in her liver. She says she misses school often and worries the same thing could happen to her young siblings. There are many victims, like Hassan and Sukna. The United Nations says 67 children under the age of 18 have been injured or killed by cluster munitions in Lebanon. Golasco says that's because so many of the cluster bombs did not explode when Israeli troops first dropped them.
They're designed very poorly, and therefore they have a very large dud rate. The dud rate means that there are a number of these weapons that just don't explode when they hit the ground.
The bomblets come down, but they don't explode when they hit the ground.
That's right. They're designed to strike the ground and blow up, but that doesn't always happen. And so you get large numbers of dud fields, which basically turns into a minefield on the ground, and it creates a humanitarian crisis because now people are in their homes, in their fields, driving around in basically landmine fields.
On the day we visited Yokmor, 16 months after the war ended, mine removal teams found 2 more dud cluster munitions in an olive grove and field. A non-profit group called MAG, or Mines Advisory Group, is trying to clean up Yokmor. So far, MAG workers have removed more than 6,200 dud cluster munitions from Yokmor alone, and they find 2 or 3 more every day.
We've discovered a submunition, an M-series submunition. It's in a fully armed state. It's slightly corroded, so it can't be made safe, so this will be destroyed later today. The lethal radius of one of these submunitions is anywhere between 8 to 10 meters.
Andy Gleason, one of the MAG workers, says the small bomblets blend easily into the brush and can be difficult to see. If this cluster submunition exploded, everyone in a 30-foot radius would likely die. This lethal radius makes cleaning up cluster munitions an especially dangerous job. At least 13 mine clearance workers have died on the job in southern Lebanon. Every foot of contaminated area must be gingerly checked twice. A MAG team in heavy protective gear demonstrated the painstaking process for us in a safe area. Not one rock is left unturned. After the inch-by-inch visual search, a mechanical mine detector rechecks the area. Every afternoon at 1 o'clock, all the dud cluster submunitions found that day in Yokmor are destroyed. You can see just how devastating a bomb blast can be in this controlled detonation of just 2 cluster bombs. Israel has come under intense internal and international criticism for its use of cluster bombs in the 2006 war against Hezbollah. The war started when Hezbollah, which the U.S. labels a terrorist organization, sent its fighters across the border into Israel here, where they killed 3 Israeli soldiers and kidnapped 2 others. That raid provoked an Israeli retaliation. The Israeli military used everything from warplanes and rockets to tanks and troops in an effort to destroy Hezbollah. At the same time, Hezbollah fighters, who often don't wear uniforms, fired thousands of rockets and artillery shells into Israel from heavily populated civilian areas in Lebanon.
A ceasefire ended the war after more than a month of fighting. Hezbollah survived and Israeli forces withdrew from southern Lebanon, but they left behind tens of thousands of dud cluster bombs fired by Israeli forces. The UN estimates there could be up to 1 million duds. It may surprise you to learn where many of the cluster bombs used by Israel in the war came from.
Most of the cluster munitions used during the war in Lebanon in 2006 were American-manufactured weapons that Israel has received from a variety of different agreements that they have with the United States to purchase and acquire weapons of war.
At least 8 U.S. publicly traded companies have made cluster bombs or their components, including General Dynamics, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. Garlasco says there are upwards of 1 billion submunitions in the U.S. arsenal. The Pentagon has sold or distributed cluster bombs to more than 20 countries besides Israel, including India, Pakistan, Greece, and Turkey. Hezbollah also used cluster bombs during the war, firing about 100 Chinese-made cluster munitions and thousands of rockets packed with ball bearings into Israel. But this was the first time Hezbollah had used cluster munitions. Mark Galasco of Human Rights Watch believes Hezbollah got its cluster bombs from Iran through Syria.
Well, we know Hezbollah was able to get the weapon. The concern is that other non-state actors will now have access to them or already have them in their arsenals. And then what if you have an organization like Al-Qaeda that was able to get some of these cluster munitions and use them in civilian areas? It's something that's of grave concern.
How expensive are they?
Oh, they're actually very cheap. Cluster munitions are fairly cheap. You can get them, I mean, it's not like I go out and purchase them on the open market, but when militaries buy them and you buy them in bulk, you can get the submunitions down to less than $1.
You see on this one, it says 5-76. This means this bomb was loaded with the cluster munitions in May 1976.
Chris Clark is the United Nations Program Manager for Mine Clearance in southern Lebanon. In the unusual garden in front of the UN office in Tyre, Clark keeps some of the bomb parts he's found in Lebanon. He says the UN has found 6 different types of cluster submunitions. One type was manufactured in Israel, and some of the American weapons were left over from the Vietnam War. Every type, he says, has often failed to operate correctly.
Practically everything that could go wrong with these has gone wrong, and we see this on numerous sites. We have a type of cluster bomb here called an M85. It's an Israeli-designed cluster bomb. That has a manufacturer's and a military in-service failure rate, if you like, of less than 1%. It's 0.085% on there. We have proven on the ground here that this munition has a failure rate, in reality, of at least 10%.
Clark says on average the cluster bombs they are finding have about a 30% failure rate, but some fail as often as 70% of the time. This map in Clark's office shows the 963 cluster bomb strikes the UN has found in Lebanon to date. Clark, who has worked in several other nations removing cluster bombs, says he was surprised by the number of dud cluster munitions in Lebanon.
After the NATO bombing campaign in Kosovo in 1999, Kosovo had what was considered a huge cluster bomb problem. We had cleared around 25,000 individual cluster bombs, and that was considered to be about 90% of the overall problem. Here in South Lebanon, in the last year and a bit since the end of the war, to date we have cleared over 135,000 individual cluster bombs, and that's compounded by the fact that South Lebanon is a very small location. The end result is there's not much of day-to-day life in South Lebanon that's not touched in some way, shape or form by these munitions.
But no one knows where those duds are, because the maps Israeli military gave the UN only indicate where old landmines were buried, not where the cluster bombs fell.
They did hand over a danger area map that sort of said, you know, here be dragons on there, so with no reference to cluster bombs at all. So for our purposes, absolutely useless.
Clark says Israel has never turned over detailed information called strike data, showing precisely where or how many cluster bombs they dropped.
What we need is the official term is the strike data. It's not a map, it's a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet, in one column will be the grid reference of the target, so we know where to go and look, the number of individual munitions fired into that area, and the type.
The UN has asked repeatedly for that information, but Israel says the strike data is a military secret and they are not required to release it.
I think that they fear that whoever gets this information could learn quite a bit on the rationale behind the usage of this weapon.
Ido is a reservist in the Israeli army. He asked us not to show his face or give his last name for fear of reprisal. During the war, Ido says he operated a rocket launcher which fired cluster munitions. He says the Army wanted to leave duds behind to create de facto minefields.
They had a specific target, they were shooting at that target, and the side effect, a very desirable side effect, was leaving those duds behind. These duds prevent those people, the Lebanese that they were shooting at, it prevents them from returning to those places. And in a military point of view, that's a really desirable outcome. You don't have to go there, but you get the place mined.
Ido says his unit launched most of the cluster munitions during the last few days of the war. The UN says it has evidence Israel dropped 90% of the cluster munitions during the last 72 hours of the fighting, when a ceasefire was imminent. A recent internal Israeli army investigation concluded that cluster munitions were only fired in civilian areas in direct response to enemy fire from Hezbollah. This video, released by Israel, shows what they say is Hezbollah launching rockets from civilian areas. Ido, the Israeli soldier, thinks the strike data would show something else. He thinks it would show that Israel was deliberately targeting cluster munitions on civilian areas, heedless of the consequences. He says that could violate the agreement under which Israel bought the cluster bombs from the U.S. and the international laws of war.
It's a weapon that you have no control on after it's fired. It's a stupid bomb. It's not guided, not aimed, not nothing. It's just gonna go boom. And when you shoot this at an area where there's a high chance of civilian presence, then according to the Geneva Conventions, you could be charged with crimes of war.
But a committee appointed by the Israeli government to look at the performance of the Israeli Defense Forces during the war found no evidence that the military consciously violated the rules of international humanitarian law. But the committee did say the use of cluster bombs should be reevaluated. And regarding the use of the weapon, quote, there was a sustained state of vagueness in instructions, lack of operational discipline and orders that led to deviation from explicit command regulations that was not recognized or prevented, end quote. We wanted to ask the Israeli Defense Forces about their decision to use cluster bombs, but they declined to be interviewed on camera. They did send us a written statement which reads in part, quote, Israel made use of legal weaponry only, including cluster munitions. It should be emphasized that international law does not prohibit the use of cluster munitions. Not only is the use of cluster munitions legal, it is a form of weaponry used by virtually every army in the Western world. In its use of cluster munitions, Israel acted in accordance with the laws of war, particularly the principles of distinction and proportionality, end quote. According to international law, cluster bombs can be used against what are called legitimate military targets, but they cannot be deliberately fired at civilians.
From the legal perspective, if it's a lawful weapon system, it's a legitimate target, then it's a legitimate attack. And international law does not currently have a requirement of taking into consideration post-war effects of the civilian population as part of your attack. That's not a legal requirement yet.
Dan Reisner, the former head of international law for the Israeli army, says legally Israel was within its rights and within the law when they launched cluster munitions.
Now comes the question of morality, strategy, etc. What do you want to achieve? Obviously, using a weapon system which has a long-term effect on the civilian population is something you should take into consideration, especially if you want to make peace after the war. All sides of a conflict have post-war repercussions and ramifications. They don't make them unlawful. They do prove, once again, the real downside of having a war.
Israel is not the only army to use cluster bombs. The U.S. has used them in many conflicts. American forces dropped about 15,000 cluster bombs in Cambodia in the early 1970s. Some of the duds there continue to injure children today. More recently, NATO forces dropped cluster bombs in Kosovo during the Balkan War in 1999, where more than 152 non-combatants were injured or killed. After that war, the U.S. military dropped the bombs in Afghanistan in 2001 and again in Iraq in 2003, where this child was injured by a cluster bomb while playing soccer. The U.S. Defense Department declined to be interviewed for this report, but an official source told us the U.S. is opposed to banning all cluster munitions because, quote, the U.S. Armed Forces rely heavily on cluster munitions for indirect tactical fire, as do many other militaries in the world, unquote. Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont thinks this Pentagon policy is just plain wrong.
I think it's immoral. It'd be immoral to use poison gas, for example. It'd be immoral to use chemical weapons. When something that you know, long after armies have left the battlefield, that there are going to be things that are still going to kill civilians, still going to kill people long after the peace treaties have been signed. Use of them, in my book, that's immoral.
Retired Major General Giora Eilen is the former head of military planning for the Israeli Defense Forces. He says cluster bombs are no worse than other weapons of war.
It is, I would say, naive to believe that these are the most deadly or most lethal weapons that are used even against civilians. Much more civilians are killed by, let's say, ordinary other bombs, whether they are sometimes Israeli attacks in Gaza or in Lebanon, or American attacks in Afghanistan or in Iraq. So there is nothing so specific about this. You want to support a war when you only kill the bad guys. But whenever you begin to see pictures of innocent civilians, children, women, in the streets, you tend to say, well, that's not exactly the war that I supported. But unfortunately, to a certain extent, these are part of the results of this war, whether you like it or not.
Senator, you must hear this kind of criticism time to time. Say, listen, Senator Leahy's a nice senator, and he's an idealist, and that's good, but we can't always apply idealism to our military strategy, tactics, and weaponry.
I'm not trying to apply idealism. I'm trying to apply realism. I have a pretty good idea what is needed. I talk to an awful lot of military. There are certain things that if we can get rid of them, we should. I don't think you will find many in our military today, if any, or commanders in the field, say, sure, let's use something that's got a 20 or 30 or 40% dud rate. They're not going to, because their own soldiers might have to march through that same area a month later. They don't want to do it. They know better to do it. It's not being naive.
But retired Israeli General Eiland says the situation is much more complex in the kinds of wars often fought today.
One of the problems is that whenever you fight against terrorist organization or guerrilla organization, then the ordinary question that usually commander used to ask their intelligence officer, where is the enemy, are not relevant anymore, because the real questions today is who is the enemy? And this is a very confusing question, or at least the answer is very confusing, because there is no clear definition between combatants and other people.
Senator Leahy says that moral and tactical considerations should lead the U.S. to stop giving and selling these weapons to other countries.
We should not be exporting them. I don't think that there is any clear way you can guarantee how they're going to be used. I'm very much in favor of not exporting our cluster munitions to any country, because they do become indiscriminate weapons of war, and if mistakes are made on either side in their use, if their American munitions are used, America's going to get the blame.
Senator Leahy has already had some success in his policy. He sponsored legislation signed into law by President Bush that will ban the U.S. from selling or trading stockpiled cluster munitions to other countries for 1 year. But the senator faces an uphill battle to win an all-out ban on cluster bombs. Earlier this month, the U.S. Army announced that Lockheed Martin will make the next generation of cluster munitions, bombs that are expected to have a lower dud rate. Meanwhile, Mark Galasco and Human Rights Watch plan to release a report later this week that they say finds Israel violated international humanitarian law when they used cluster bombs during the war. Human Rights Watch previously released a report that accused Hezbollah of war crimes. Coming up next, a personal pledge from the director of FEMA 7 months later. And now, an update into our continuing investigation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. We've reported several times on the so-called toxic trailers, the camper homes that were provided to victims of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and how the residents of the coast who live in the trailers, a lot of residents, have been getting sick. Many of those same people were glad to hear the director of FEMA, David Paulison, give his personal pledge before Congress last summer that his agency would do everything it could to help the people who needed it most.
I want to find out very clearly what the issue is and where the problem is and what we can do about it. Again, the answer is to get people out of the travel trailers.
In July of last year, the House Committee on Government Oversight made official what had been talked about on the Gulf Coast for months, and which we reported months before the hearing. The toxic chemical formaldehyde was making people who lived in FEMA trailers sick. At the hearing, FEMA's administrator, David Paulison, tried to assure Congress that FEMA was fixing the problem. But Committee Chairman Henry Waxman was not impressed.
The public was appalled by the incompetence of FEMA after Hurricane Katrina. Regarding formaldehyde in FEMA trailers, I see the same indifference, lack of concern, and incompetence. What about where people were living?
Mr. Chair, we were not formaldehyde experts. We were taking this as it went along, as this thing developed and got larger and larger. We recognize now that we have an issue. We are dealing with it in the best manner we can.
Committee members were irate over independent tests of hundreds of trailers that revealed high levels of formaldehyde. One of those trailers was Lindsay Huckabee's. She had lived in a FEMA mobile home in Mississippi for the past 2 years and traveled to Washington to testify. Afterwards, she got a personal promise from the head of FEMA.
We just need to come out and talk to you, and if your trailer's
We first met Lindsay Huckabee 6 months prior to the hearing, when we accompanied the Sierra Club on a visit to test her family's mobile home for formaldehyde. Lindsay, her husband Steve, and their 5 children had been sick continuously since moving in, just after the storm. This is what she told us then.
The nosebleeds and stuff were down to maybe 1 every 2 weeks, but for a while there it was several a week.
The Sierra Club's test results, performed by an independent lab, came back positive for formaldehyde. And though FEMA delivered a replacement to the Huckabees, the second home also had high levels of formaldehyde. That was before the hearing and Paulison's promises. But it's been 7 months since Huckabee met Paulison, and she says she has not heard a word from FEMA in Washington. The family continues to share this cramped mobile home with 1 bathroom and room for just 3 beds, shared among the 5 children.
It's me. 3 in this room, 2 in that room, and actually it's 4 in this room, 1 in that room.
Michael sleeps in here with me.
The Huckabees are just one of thousands of families who complained about formaldehyde. Formaldehyde can be found in the glues and particle boards of building products, such as the walls and cabinets of trailers. Most experts say it is a known carcinogen and can cause a variety of health problems. Many health and safety organizations recommend very low exposure limits. In fact, back in 2006, FEMA was concerned enough about reports of formaldehyde that it asked the Centers for Disease Control for guidance on what a safe level of formaldehyde would be. The CDC's Director of Toxicology sent an email to the upper levels of FEMA and said when it came to formaldehyde, quote, "It is a matter of science policy that there is no safe level of exposure." But FEMA never included these concerns in any report.
Whenever I found out that, since way back in 2006, people knew about the formaldehyde, they knew the symptoms, I got very angry. For months, I didn't know what was wrong with my kids. Over a year, really, I didn't know what was wrong with my kids, and somebody knew. Somewhere, there's still people who don't know why their kids are sick, why their nose are bleeding, why they're missing school with, coughs and ear infections and things like that.
The Huckabees say these symptoms started only after moving into their mobile home, and scientific studies suggest that these symptoms could likely be caused by formaldehyde exposure.
Michael was born shortly after we moved into the trailer, actually within 2 weeks of us getting our first FEMA trailer, and he just turned 2. He's been back and forth with sinus infections, ear infections. He also, for some reason, has been turning blue. And we did some cardiac tests on him and everything and established that it's not his heart.
Popcorn!
My children have missed a lot of school since we've gotten in the FEMA trailer. Last year, Layla was in kindergarten and she missed 43 days, I believe.
I had nosebleeds a lot.
The Huckabees, like many others, cannot afford to move out just yet.
The medical bills have definitely offset what we should be saving by living in the FEMA trailers. Most people think, well, you've been living rent-free for 2 years, you should have been able to buy a house by now. But we're spending close to what we were paying on rent between medical bills, gas going back and forth to the doctor, prescriptions, things like that.
Huckabee wasn't the only one to receive promises at the Washington hearings in July. Paul Stewart, a resident of Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, testified about losing his home. He also got assurances from FEMA's administrator, David Paulison.
So we want to make sure we do things right. So I appreciate that. It gives me good information. Thanks a lot.
Stuart and his wife Melody were among the first to recognize formaldehyde as a problem with the FEMA trailers. We met them a year ago after they had rejected the third formaldehyde-laden trailer given to them by FEMA.
If this is the best that FEMA can do, then everyone in this country should be very afraid if something happens in their neighborhood tomorrow. When you see children living in contaminated campers and you just continue to go about your business and not only ignore the problem, but even cover the problem up, the CDC said there is no level of formaldehyde that is safe, regardless of duration. And yet that information never made it to the public. It made it to FEMA, and it made it up the chain in CDC, but it never made it to the public.
The CDC's concerns from 2006 became public in January this year. FEMA responded by saying, quote, "At no time did FEMA condone any action to mislead anyone in connection with the health and safety of the people we are dedicated to helping. Such activities would be completely contrary to our mission and our commitment to victims of disaster."
Well, as we speak, right now, what is FEMA doing to alleviate the problem?
FEMA has started a testing program to test the levels of formaldehyde inside the campers.
2 years after?
2.5 years after the storm. And arguably, they waited as long as they could to allow as much of the formaldehyde to off-gas as possible. And they did the testing in the coldest, driest months of the year. One of the representatives in Mississippi said, the reason it's taken so long is because we have to figure out how to interpret the results. Why do you have to interpret the results? The results are pretty straightforward. Either it's contaminated or it's not. It's a black and white issue.
They said, well, we have to figure out how to analyze the results before they went to get the results?
Yes.
That doesn't make sense.
No, sir, it doesn't. It absolutely does not make sense. It is, again, it was a delay tactic. You know, for every day that FEMA delayed, a child stayed in one of those campers for another day. And to this day, they're still there. They're still in there. You know, when you look at a situation where there are still 40,000 families living in campers 2.5 years after the storm.
Let me pause right there. Let's say that again. If 40,000?
40,000 campers are still out there. That's a serious number. That's a lot of people. There are a lot of different disasters that happened. First it was Katrina. You know, then it was the insurance companies. Then it was FEMA. Talking about originally losing your home and everything that you had. You know, your community, not just your home, but your community. Then you throw on top of that insurance you thought you had. So now you're fighting with the insurance companies to get back what you're really owed. And then at the same time you try to rebuild. And how do you keep getting kicked and not eventually just break?
Public health experts are worried about the general long-term consequences of those displaced by the hurricanes, far beyond formaldehyde. A study released in October by Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health estimates that between 45,000 and 65,000 children remain displaced and at risk for long-term health and social problems. Of the children studied, nearly a third were found to have developed depression, anxiety, or behavior disorders since the hurricanes. It's Mardi Gras in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi.
Happy Mardi Gras!
This little coastal community is coming back to life after all but being leveled by the storm. More than 90% of the homes here were destroyed by Katrina's wind and water. Last year, Mississippi was given millions of dollars to rebuild with affordable homes called Katrina cottages, cottages that are seen by some here as a poor replacement to the magnificent mansions that once dotted the coastline. Jesse John Finneran wants to move a Katrina cottage onto his land. He used to work for FEMA, but he can't get approval because he thinks local residents are worried about property values.
Bay St. Louis has been very resistant. I tried to get one here. When I brought the plans and said, here's my certificate, here's everything else, here's what I want to do, can I do that? And they said, get back to me. Nobody's gotten back to me. It seems like every time that people have gone to set up a plan for their future, something's changed.
Last year, the federal government gave Mississippi $275 million to buy 4,000 of these cottages, but just 1,200 have been handed out so far, and on the outskirts of Bay St. Louis, there is row after row of empty cottages.
So now the city's going to decide what someone can live in? Why don't we decide who can come to the city? Maybe that's what they're doing. Eventually, they'll just squeeze out the little guys. And eventually, there's going to be no desire to stay here. They have no drainage. The city's done nothing with the drainage in the streets. All the sewers were left open. It was hard even to get utilities down here to start with.
Whether these cottages are meant to be permanent homes or a step up from the trailers is one of the many debates going on all along the Gulf Coast. After all, 75,000 homes were destroyed and only 20% have been rebuilt. Further complicating the rebuilding process, home insurance rates have increased sharply in the region.
You're talking about insurance rates that are almost unmanageable, where people are going to have to make decisions. Do I build my house, and can I even afford the insurance? You know, insurance rates are going to cost more than the actual mortgage on the people's homes.
So Stewart, formerly a police officer in Bay St. Louis, has given up on FEMA, and for now, trying to rebuild his life in Mississippi. He has returned to his hometown of Boston to pursue a law degree, the better, he says, to help storm victims eventually get justice.
This whole process has taught me one thing, and I think I need to carry a bigger stick.
The philosophy of this organization that I put in place since I've been here is that the victim comes first above everything else that we do.
The president could stand up tomorrow and direct Director Paulison, get these people out of these campers tomorrow. And it would happen. How can we as a country sit there and say 40,000 people have no value? 40,000 families have no value. This is the responsibility ultimately of us as a country. What do we stand for? Do we believe in basic human dignity? Do we believe in protecting the future, the children of this country? And if we do, then we need to step up and do the right thing.
It's not just the Gulf Coast residents who are allegedly being sickened by formaldehyde. FEMA supplied tornado victims in Kansas with these same type campers. And the agency has sold off more than 10,000 trailers to the public. However, in light of the formaldehyde concern, those in the general public who purchased a FEMA trailer at an average price of $7,000 are now eligible for a full refund from the government. Just ahead now, is this or is it not a recession? A top economist with a proven track record goes on the record. Finally tonight, we turn to a topic that has quickly become a top concern around the country, the economy. Recession, that dreaded R word, has leapt from the business pages to the front pages. Subprime loans are causing nightmares for homeowners and world financial markets. And for the first time in years, jobs are beginning to disappear even in industries that had seen growth. To try to make at least some sense of this uncertainty, we talked to Dr. Gary Schilling, a former chief economist for Merrill Lynch. For more than 4 decades, Dr. Schilling has made his living forecasting the shifting winds of the economy. He's predicted booms and busts, and 4 years ago, he raised the alarm of a looming mortgage crisis. Today, he sees more dark clouds stretching into the horizon.
We're probably in a recession. It could very well be a deep recession, rank with the deepest that we've seen in the post-World War II era, and probably run the balance of this year. In other words, it may be next year before the economy starts to recover.
I'll speak frankly to you, you're scaring me here.
Well, the whole objective is not to scare people, it's to prepare them. It's to get people ready so that at least they're not going to be blindsided, that they're not going to be feeling, oh my goodness, I had no idea this could happen.
For someone who's watching, got a good job, not getting wealthy, but middle class, economic class, doing okay, and who's watching is just saying, well, what can I do? What should I do? Any practical advice for them?
Sure do. For one thing, if our viewer is like a lot of people, they have been using their house as a piggy bank. They have been using a home equity loan or a home equity line of credit to pull money out of that appreciation that's accumulated in the house over the years to cover spending on, you know, a cruise, a night out on the town, a new computer.
College?
College, yeah, anything. They also might have refinanced their house and taken cash out of the deal. Or maybe they simply say, you know, that house is a constantly filling piggy bank that will take care of the kids' education, early retirement, maybe a few round-the-world cruises in between, so I can go out and save less if I'm saving anything at all, or borrow more on my credit card because I know this house is going to take care of that.
Right.
That sort of behavior, I highly recommend, should be stopped yesterday, because house prices are declining. And our estimates are that for most people, that home equity is going to be virtually wiped out by further declines. And the average homeowner who has any mortgage at all in this country has 31% equity in their house after you take off all the mortgages. So that really says for most people they're not going to have any equity. So I highly recommend that people figure out a way to save more, to pay down credit card debt wherever they can, not to skip payments on mortgages or anything else, but get very, very cautious in their spending habits. Most people can't do much in the short run to increase their income. The flexibility is in the spending. And that to me is where people should be very, very careful and cautious and very thrifty.
It occurs to me, we have this subprime crisis, disaster, catastrophe too strong?
Catastrophe is a perfectly appropriate word. I don't think it's loaded.
All right, now who's to blame for this, or is there any particular set of people to blame for it?
If I were to put it in a very succinct phrase, I'd say it's too many people who thought there was such a thing as free lunch. The borrowers, people who had been renting, who really could not afford a house, and they accepted the idea that they could. They didn't have to put anything down. It was all the people who originated all these loans and sold them off and said, you know, that's not my responsibility. I'm making huge fees. I don't have to worry about it. It was the investors in these securities, these various securitized pieces of paper built one on top of another. They were driven to feel that they deserved 20% returns on their portfolios each and every year.
Where were these regulators when this was happening?
The regulators were behind the curve. There was a lot of pressure from the real estate industry to avoid increasing regulation because they were all making so much money and having such a wonderful party. And again, they were getting their share of free lunch. But the regulators and I think Congress is certainly responsible as well. We're obviously not as vigilant on this. There's also this philosophical question, you know, are we a nanny state or are we one where you're responsible for your own mistakes and financial difficulties? But I think it's fair to say that the regulators were certainly not as aggressive, and there was a lot of forces that were restraining them. But it was only last fall that the Federal Reserve and others who do regulate this area, FDIC and so on, finally issued regulations that said, hey, you shouldn't lend money. They're talking to lenders. You shouldn't lend money to people who are not going to be able to not only make the payments on this current teaser rate, low mortgage rate, but to people who won't be able to make it when it resets to higher levels. That's a no-no. They finally said that. They also said you shouldn't lend money to people who are not going to give you documentation as to what their income is. They won't
but they came to this fairly late.
Very late. Yeah. And by the way, a lot of the lenders and the mortgage brokers and so on, that's a huge lobby, the real estate brokers in this country. They were besieging Congress to delay this kind of regulatory oversight.
These are the people who contributed to congressional election campaigns.
You bet. Right. You bet. And they can marshal a lot of people if they want to, and they do. They throw their weight around. So this wasn't just that the regulators. They actually wanted to tighten up on this about 3 years ago, but were under tremendous pressure from Congress not to do so. National Association of Realtors in this country is a very strong organization.
Big lobby arm.
Oh, big lobby arm, yeah. And these are the real estate brokers we all know in our local communities.
Well, where are we headed? I know it's hard to predict, but you predicted a severe housing downturn. You did it before almost anybody else did it. You were well ahead of the curve. In your opinion, how many people are going to default on their mortgages and lose their homes, whether they walk away with them or it's foreclosed on them?
I would say at least a couple of million people who will be parted from their houses under rather unpleasant circumstances, whether they walk away, whether they are foreclosed on, default, whatever, but I would think it'll be probably at least a couple of million if you look at numbers like that.
When I get this percentage right, in the last year, correct me if I'm wrong, housing sales are down almost 35%.
Right.
And the median home price has plummeted almost 12%.
Right.
When do you think the housing market will start up again, or do you think it will?
In housing, like any goods-producing sector of the economy, the mortal enemy of prices is excess inventories. In other words, when you've got more houses than are currently demanded, and we estimate that 2 million extra houses were built between 1995 and 2005. When you have that huge overhang of excess inventories, it does two things. One is it takes a long time to get rid of them, because we only build about 1.5 million houses a year, and you got 2 million excess. It takes a while to get rid of. And secondly, it's very, very lethal for prices. Prices, though, will probably continue to fall longer because of this excess inventory issue, and we see that continuing through 2010.
I'm told you have the theory that for a lot of people, renting is better than buying a house. Now, there are any number of people, I'm one of them, who grew up with the advice, listen, buy a house as soon as you can. Get in a house. Rent money goes right up the chimney. It's wasted money. If you're going to save anything, you're going to have any kind of asset, get a house.
There are two reasons that suggest, well, three reasons that suggest that home ownership is superior. One is the emotional. It's the, I'm a big do-it-yourselfer, and boy, you couldn't separate me from my house. My wife has been trying to do that for years. But you know, the emotional attachment, the pride of ownership, and that's certainly a very valid point. A second one has been the forced saving. In other words, if you have a mortgage to pay down, it forces you to save more money than you might otherwise. And the third factor, and the one that has disappeared, is appreciation. Right. But if you don't have appreciation, then on an economic front, you're better off renting a house.
You know, I spent some time in Washington, and I hear pretty regularly in Washington, well, we may not be in a recession, we may be moving into one, but you think we're already in one?
I do. And bear in mind that most economists and almost every politician may have lived through a lot of recessions, but never forecast one. I mean, for politicians, unless you're the opposition and really trying to blast the incumbents, you never talk about a recession. And economists, and I can say this from my own personal experience, forecasting recessions can cut your job tenure tremendously. You can get fired. I was twice by Don Regan and Merrill Lynch for forecasting a recession. Once when I was chief economist of Merrill Lynch, and the second time when I was at another Wall Street firm, Whitewell, that was bought by Merrill Lynch. So he fired me a second time.
Donald Reagan later became Secretary of the Treasury.
Oh yeah, Secretary of the Treasury and Chief of Staff of the White House. Yeah, very powerful man.
There are a lot of Americans who are into adulthood now who they've never gone through a deep recession. Is there some chance that this will lead to panic?
It can certainly lead to a lot of unhappiness, and I think particularly among consumers, because American consumers have been borrowing and spending with gay abandon since the early 80s. That's why we have this huge trade deficit. That's why the rest of the world owns so much of America. That's why the rest of the world has all this money that they can use to come to the rescue of Wall Street firms. It's really because of this profligacy of American consumers, and it is going to be one huge shock. A lot of people are going to lose jobs before this is over, and those that aren't are no longer going to have that house appreciation to rely on.
But we have this $168 billion stimulus package. And the word out of Washington now, well, we may have been a little late to come to this, but help is on the way, and this is going to settle things down. And this recession, if indeed, this is their words, if indeed it exists, is not going to be all that deep. What are the chances this $168 billion stimulus package will do it?
It can certainly help alleviate the bottom of the recession and give a little boost to the recovery, but it's not going to prevent a recession. I mean, first of all, they're not going to be able to get these checks out until basically the second half of the year. Secondly, people who do have the money, well, the last time we had this was 2001, and middle-class people only spend about 20% of those rebates. As far as lower-income people, yeah, they live hand-to-mouth, and they will spend it. Some of them will probably be forced to use it to pay down debts, or at least pressured by credit card companies for credit card debts and paying on their mortgage. And of course, there's another feature too. To the extent they spend that in Walmart on goods that are produced in China, that doesn't go to create U.S. production and jobs. That goes right out of the country.
If you had been a member of Congress, would you have voted for the stimulus package?
Yes, I would have. Yes, I would have. And if for no other reason than I want to get reelected. I mean, it's amazing what an election year can do for the zeal of Congress, for the constituents. And you know, look at the presidential hopefuls. I mean, just a couple of months ago, there was no concern about the economy. And by the way, there wasn't really in Wall Street. The politicians aren't that far behind investors in general this time.
Well, I thought Wall Street was supposed to be, and I mean this respectfully, the masters of the universe, that they know all these things.
Oh yeah, right, wonderful. And in my view, Wall Street was very slow to react to this. I mean, again, there was this feeling that the housing thing is confined. The subprime difficulties, I call it the subprime slime, that this was a very narrow field. And it's only very slowly that people have been willing to admit that there are some deep problems.
What, in your judgment, is the economic situation going to be in October running up to the November presidential election?
This is going to be much, much more severe on the consumer than any recession we've had since the 1930s, in my judgment. That is going to be particularly difficult for politicians because people are going to feel, hey, I don't have the income from my job. I no longer have the appreciation in the house that I can tap to cover spending growth. And I would think they're going to take that ire out on politicians. And I would not particularly want to be an incumbent going into the first Tuesday of November to pick a random date.
Well, what are you telling the people whose investments you manage? Are you telling them, bail out, get out, put your money in a coffee can, bury it in the backyard or something, or put it into gold? What are you telling them?
Well, we're of the opinion that the dollar is about to turn around and rally. Everybody's negative on the dollar, and when you get Brooklyn rappers and Brazilian supermodels who say they want to get paid in euros and not dollars, it tells you everybody's on the same side of the boat and is probably about ready to go the other way. But in actual fact, we think that the dollar has been weak because we're the first into recession. The Federal Reserve is the first to cut interest rates, and that makes rates lower here, less attractive than investing abroad. And also, we've had all the subprime and related problems. But the rest of the world is not immune. As the recession spreads abroad, and the lag is usually about 6 months between the U.S. and the rest of the world, then I think, and we're starting to see this, by the way, the U.K. Now looks like it's in trouble. The continent of Europe is not showing growth. Japan looks like it may be back in another recession, and so on. Emerging markets depend on the U.S. So I think we'll see a global recession, and then the dollar will become the safe haven, as it usually does. But there again, you know, we are an optimistic country by nature, and the economy generally grows. It's punctuated by recessions, but it generally grows, and Wall Street gets paid for a rising market. That's what generates the revenues.
Well, do you or do you not describe the idea that we're destined to have China overtake us and become economic power of the 21st century?
I'm not of that opinion, Dan. We did some analysis of this, and we said, how many people do they have there that you can consider middle class or upper class who have the discretionary spending power to carry that economy? Well, our estimates are that in China you need to have $5,000 in income to be in that category where you can have discretionary spending.
$5,000 a year.
$5,000 a year, right, okay. In China, now there are a lot of people in that category. Our estimates are 110 million people, but that's only 8% of the Chinese population. Now, in contrast, in the US, it's 80% have that discretionary spending. In other words, China is not far enough along in the road to industrialization that it is going to sustain itself. Now, I'm talking here for the next couple of years.
Right.
And if we're looking 20, 30, 40 years down the road, yeah, I think China is going to be a major player, but you know, that's a long way away, and I'm not sure we're not going to do some wonderful things in this country in the meanwhile.
That's our report for tonight. For HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.
Very, very dangerous, because we have to work carefully. It's a bomb everywhere. The house was terrifying, the glass everywhere.
Jamal's house in the village was still standing, but she and her mother-in-law found cluster bombs everywhere.
My baby can't go outside because maybe a bomb will explode. I don't think that in America you have this problem.
هلا أنا جيت لقيت هون الأرض كلها مبذورة وهون وفوق وأسطح.
Neighbor Mahmoud Barakat says he found 50 cluster bombs in his small olive grove. Like him, most residents in this area of southern Lebanon are farmers. With dud cluster munitions covering their fields, most were forced to watch their harvest and income rot away. After the war, Galasco was touring a hospital when 3 children were rushed in. Hassan and Sukna had just returned to their village and were playing near their home when a cluster bomb exploded at their feet. They barely survived.
فقعت زتتني لورا شي مترين طلعوا نصرينا برا قمت حطيت ايدي على نصرينا صرت اركض قول الله اكبر.
Hassan spent several weeks in the hospital. More than a year later, his father tells us he still has pain in the belly and has trouble eating. Sukna still has shrapnel embedded in her liver. She says she misses school often and worries the same thing could happen to her young siblings. There are many victims like Hassan and Sukna. The United Nations says 67 children under the age of 18 have been injured or killed by cluster munitions in Lebanon. Golasco says that's because so many of the cluster bombs did not explode when Israeli troops first dropped them.
They're designed very poorly, and therefore they have a very large dud rate. The dud rate means that there are a number of these weapons that just don't explode when they hit the ground.
The bomblets come down, but they don't explode when they hit the ground.
That's right. They're designed to strike the ground and blow up, but that doesn't always happen. And so you get large numbers of dud fields, which basically turns into a minefield on the ground, and it creates a humanitarian crisis because now people are in their homes, in their fields, driving around in basically landmine fields.
On the day we visited Yokmor, 16 months after the war ended, mine removal teams found 2 more dud cluster munitions in an olive grove and field. A non-profit group called MAG, or Mines Advisory Group, is trying to clean up Yokmor. So far, MAG workers have removed more than 6,200 dud cluster munitions from Yokmor alone, and they find 2 or 3 more every day.
We've discovered a submunition, an M-series submunition. It's in a fully armed state. It's slightly corroded, so it can't be made safe, so this will be destroyed later today. The lethal radius of one of these submunitions is anywhere between 8 to 10 meters.
Andy Gleason, one of the MAG workers, says the small bomblets blend easily into the brush and can be difficult to see. If this cluster submunition exploded, everyone in a 30-foot radius would likely die. This lethal radius makes cleaning up cluster munitions an especially dangerous job. At least 13 mine clearance workers have died on the job in southern Lebanon. Every foot of contaminated area must be gingerly checked twice. A MAG team in heavy protective gear demonstrated the painstaking process for us in a safe area. Not one rock is left unturned. After the inch-by-inch visual search, a mechanical
something that you know. There are going to be things that are still going to kill civilians, still going to kill people long after the peace treaties have been signed. Use of them, in my book, that's immoral.
If this is the best that FEMA can do, then everyone in this country should be very afraid if something happens in their neighborhood tomorrow.
If I were to put it in a very succinct phrase, I'd say it's too many people who thought there was such a thing as free lunch.
Good evening. There is no such thing as a nice weapon of war. After all, weapons are designed to kill. But tonight we're going to give you a look at a weapon that not only kills during warfare, but long after the fighting is ended. And the victims are people who never fought or are no longer fighting. These weapons are cluster munitions, or cluster bombs as they're more commonly known. They're small bombs contained in a larger bomb or artillery shell, which are designed to spread and detonate over a large area. In wartime, cluster bombs are, to put it bluntly, an efficient way to kill many people in an area the size of a football field. But many of those cluster bombs don't explode on impact as they are designed to do. They go off with deadly effect after the war is over, killing people trying to rebuild their normal lives, or
mine detector rechecks the area. Every afternoon at 1 o'clock, all the Dud cluster submunitions found that day in Yokmar are destroyed. You can see just how devastating a bomb blast can be in this controlled detonation of just 2 cluster bombs. Israel has come under intense internal and international criticism for its use of cluster bombs in the 2006 war against Hezbollah. The war started when Hezbollah, which the U.S. labels a terrorist organization, sent its fighters across the border into Israel here, where they killed 3 Israeli soldiers and kidnapped 2 others. That raid provoked an Israeli retaliation. The Israeli military used everything from warplanes and rockets to tanks and troops in an effort to destroy Hezbollah. At the same time, Hezbollah fighters, who often don't wear uniforms, fired thousands of rockets and artillery shells into Israel from heavily populated civilian areas in Lebanon.
A ceasefire ended the war after more than a month of fighting. Hezbollah survived and Israeli forces withdrew from southern Lebanon, but they left behind tens of thousands of Dud cluster bombs fired by Israeli forces. The UN estimates there could be up to 1 million Duds. It may surprise you to learn where many of the cluster bombs used by Israel in the war came from.
Most of the cluster munitions used during the war in Lebanon in 2006 were American-manufactured weapons that Israel has received from a variety of different agreements that they have with the United States to purchase and acquire weapons of war.
At least 8 U.S. publicly traded companies have made cluster bombs or their components, including
too often curious children. That's what's happened in the wake of the war in the summer of 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed radical Islamic militia in southern Lebanon. That war raged for just 34 days, but people in southern Lebanon are still dying today because they stumble over cluster bombs like these.
It's about the size of a soda can and just as innocent looking. That white ribbon attached to the top is supposed to arm the bomblet when it's dropped. This is how cluster bombs are supposed to work, as seen in this Air Force video. Large bombs or missiles disperse hundreds of bomblets across a wide area, but the bomblets often don't explode on impact the way they are designed to. The Duds, also called submunitions, hang in trees or lay on the ground. Weeks or months later, just the slightest disturbance can set them off. A controlled explosion is the only way to neutralize the Duds that fail to explode.
When I got here and climbed up the stairway over there, we could see them hanging in the trees. They were in the yard. They were up on the veranda in the stairs. We even found some inside the home.
Mark Garlasco went to southern Lebanon soon after the war to assess the damage. Garlasco now works for the organization Human Rights Watch. He was a senior military analyst for the Pentagon. We recently met him in the southern Lebanese village of Yokmar.
Well, when I first got here shortly after the ceasefire, walking down the street was actually pretty difficult because there were submunitions, littered everywhere. And so you would have to zigzag as you're going around and just be very careful.
Garlasco introduced us to Jamal, who returned to her village when the shooting stopped.